Quick introduction. Welcome to Manitoba. This is a very different kind of video I wanted to make compared to my usual statistical content. I've been really interested in sharing Canadian Indigenous history to other people for quite some time now, as history has been some of my interests. I myself am Indigenous. I have Métis status as well for my family. If you are unaware, Métis people's historical homelands include the three prairie provinces. That includes my home province, Manitoba, hence the name of my channel is inspired from. Métis people are of mixed European and Indigenous ancestry. Anyway, most of you probably already know what Canada is. It's a country on Turtle Island, North America. Indigenous peoples have been on Turtle Island for tens of thousands of years before Europeans colonized. Now then, in this documentary I will be explaining Canada's residential school system. More on that later. First, a fair warning. The subject matter may be inappropriate for some viewers. Anyway, this is what I will be going over through this documentary. Keep in mind, I will be just doing a quick explanation over Canada's history with Indigenous peoples. If you want a more in-depth explanation, I got all of my sources linked in the description. I'm just giving a brief rundown of everything before I go into the main topic of residential schools. 2. Indigenous peoples. Quick explanation. Indigenous peoples are the original inhabitants to the Americas, which is now known as North and South America. When the glaciers receded during the last glacial maximum, Indigenous peoples arrived an estimated 15 to 25,000 years ago. Europeans didn't arrive until 14 to 1600s. 3. Canada's relation with Indigenous peoples. Colonization. Indian Act, Treaties, Riel, Oka Crisis. Though the Vikings landed on North America first around the 11th century, possibly in 1021, no Europeans decided to set up a permanent settlement there until the 15th century 1400s. When Europeans arrived, disease wiped out most of the indigenous populations, as Indigenous had no immunity to European diseases at the time. Though Europeans and Indigenous peoples were often in military alliance, many faced persecution from colonial governments. Indigenous lands seized, famine, cultural genocide through residential schools, and destructive legislation. Today, Canada is going through a phase of truth and reconciliation. Basically moving forward, Indigenous survivors sharing their stories and investigating the human rights violations, intergenerational impacts of harm caused by residential schools, and other factors. Indian Act. Shortly after the Confederation of Canada 1867 and 1876, the Canadian government created the Indian Act to control Indigenous peoples in Canada. The Act only applies to Indigenous peoples, excludes Métis and Inuit. The government used the Act to assimilate Indigenous peoples into Euro-Canadian society. The Indian Act determined the identity, political structures, governance, cultural practices, and education of Indigenous peoples. It also determined who would have legal Indian status. Having Indian status meant that you were allowed certain rights, such as the right to live on, reserve, and participate in band politics. Losing your status meant that you lost these rights. Indigenous peoples would lose their status as Indian if they graduated college or wanted to vote in elections, among other reasons. Women lost their Indian status if they married a non-status man. Another consequence of the Indian Act was the creation of the residential school system. Indigenous peoples, Métis and Inuit children across Canada were taken from their homes and communities and put in this system. In residential schools, Indigenous students were forbidden from speaking their language and practicing their cultures. Many children suffered from physical, psychological, and sexual abuse. Thousands of children died. The Indian Act also banned religious practices such as powwows, the potlatch, and sun dances. This had a devastating impact on the cultures and traditions of Indigenous peoples across Canada. It wasn't until the 1950s that the Canadian government started acknowledging the damaging effects of the Indian Act. The act was rewritten in 1951 and changed again in 1985, with changes focusing on the removal of discriminatory sections. The Indian Act still exists, determining rules around reserves, elections, and aspects of life on reserve. The Racist and Discriminatory Act has had major consequences across Indigenous peoples' communities that continue to be felt today. The fur trade. Although not all things were bad, this was before Canada itself existed. In the 1600s, the fur trade lasted nearly 250 years in the area where Canada would come to be. It was the foundation of Canada's early economy and the beginning of the country's reliance on natural resources. The first Europeans came to this land for fish, but soon offered fur in trades with Indigenous peoples. Both English and French settlers fought with one another for access to fur and other resources. They would bring pelts back to Europe and use them in the creation of felt hats and other clothing. Demand was high as these felt hats were very fashionable in Europe at the time. The fur trade expanded westward. As demand grew, young fur traders traveled with Indigenous guides. They were called voyageurs and coureurs des bois. In the interior, traders formed alliances with Indigenous peoples, which would lead to the creation of the Métis Nation. The Hudson Bay Company established a vast network of trading posts. The beaver fur trade facilitated the colonization of these vast territories and the eventual creation of Canada. Treaties. During the 1600s to today, many treaties with Indigenous peoples occurred. A treaty is an agreement concluded between sovereign states, nations. In Canada, treaties are agreements made between the Canadian government and Indigenous groups, and often provinces or territories, that define ongoing rights and commitments on all sides. Almost immediately after Confederation, Canada wanted to expand west to meet the Pacific Ocean. This was for Canada's industrial development and white settlement. Obviously, all this territory was Indigenous inhabited lands, which Canada wanted to have. They can't just outright steal Indigenous land, so they would have to negotiate with Indigenous peoples with treaties. There is this thing called numbered treaties, a series of 11 treaties signed between Canada and First Nations in exchange for Indigenous peoples' territory for industrial development and settlement. The government negotiations made promises to Indigenous peoples, both verbally and written text within the treaties, that include special rights to treaty lands and distribution of cash payments, hunting, fishing tools, and farming supplies. These kinds of agreements are controversial and opposed. Louis Riel, the Red River Resistance, and Northwest Rebellion. A short time before the numbered treaties and after the first few treaties, there was a revolt against the Canadian government within the area that would eventually be Manitoba, Saskatchewan, and Alberta. Louis Riel, Métis leader, founder of Manitoba, and main figure in what would be the revolt against the Canadian government, the Red River Resistance and Northwest Rebellion. The reasoning for the rebellion was rising fear and insecurity among Métis and First Nations as the fur trade ended, the great bison herds disappearing along with land signed away with treaties. The once expansive prairies now have towns, farms, and railways. Indigenous peoples depended on all the things that disappeared. They were waiting without much help for the federal government. The government lacked actions to their promises. Louis Riel was hanged for treason. I won't go over more of this as there is still one more category to explain before the main topic of this video, which is residential schools. If you do want to learn and read more about all these, I have my sources linked in the description of this video. The last part I will be doing a quick explanation is the Oka Crisis. Oka Crisis. The Colonization Resistance, or Oka Crisis, also known as the Mohawk Resistance at Colonization, a standoff lasting 78 days between Kanyenkia, Mohawk protesters, Quebec police, and the Canadian Army. This took place in the community of Colonization, which includes a commons area known as the Pines near the town of Oka on the north shore of Montreal. It was a border dispute over Indigenous territory. This border dispute dates back to the late 1700s. Again, I won't go over the complete history of the Oka Crisis as I have all my sources in the description if you want to read more about it. Anyway, the crisis was sparked by the proposed expansion of a golf course and the development of townhouses on disputed land in the Pines that included a canyon a sacred burial ground. Tensions were high after the death of a police officer. Eventually, the Canadian Army was involved and the protests eventually ended. The gold course expansion was cancelled and the lands were bought by the federal government. However, the lands were never transferred back to the Mohawks of Colonization nor as a reserve. Although the resistance inspired Indigenous peoples across Canada to take action. 4. Residential schools. Before we get into the main topic of this documentary, this is my final warning. From this point on, information may be upsetting and disturbing to some viewers. Viewer discretion is advised. Thank you. Now, let's get into this. The residential school system were government-sponsored religious schools that were created to assimilate Indigenous children into Euro-Canadian culture. Although the first residential facilities were created in New France, the term usually refers to schools established after 1880. They were created by the Canadian government and Christian churches as an attempt to educate and convert Indigenous youth to assimilate them into Canadian society. However, this only disrupted lives and communities. Long-term issues among Indigenous peoples. Residential schools do not exist anymore today. The last one closed in 1996, Grolier Hall, closed in 1997, was not a state-run residential school. In that year, former students have demanded recognition and restitution, resulting in the Indian Residential Schools Settlement Agreement in 2007 and a formal public apology by Prime Minister Stephen Harper in 2008. An estimated 150,000 First Nation, Inuit, and Métis children attended residential schools. Key facts. Here is an image of key facts from the Canadian Encyclopedia of an article of residential schools in Canada by J.R. Miller, published October 10, 2012, updated by Tabitha De Bruin, David Gallant, Michelle Fielis, last updated January 11, 2024 as of October 25, 2024. How was life there? Before the 1950s, the school system ran on a half-day system, in which students spent half the day in class and the other working. It's thought that this was to teach students skills and earn a living as adults. In reality, the work had more to do with running the school cheaply rather than providing students with vocational training. Daily routine. School days start early, usually with a bell that gets students to dress and attend chapel or mass. Students then perform chores before breakfast. Breakfast was basic and eaten quickly in a dining hall. This was followed by 3 hours of classes or a period of work before stopping for lunch. The afternoon schedule followed a similar pattern, including either classes or work, followed by more chores before supper. Time was also set aside for recreation, usually in the afternoon or evening. Some schools had small libraries, while many schools offered organized sports as well as musical instruction, including choirs and brass bands. The evening closed with prayer, and bedtime was early. It was a highly strictly organized system. On weekends, there were no classes, but Sunday, they meant more time spent on religious practices. After the 1940s, holidays for many of the students included periods of work and play at the school. Only from the 1960s on did the schools routinely send children home for holidays. Therefore, many students in the residential school system were separated and not allowed to see their family for years. Education and vocational training in residential schools. Students received poor education overall, even in both terms of academic subject and vocational training. Students had to deal with teachers who are usually not ready, and subjects and materials derived from and reflecting an alien culture. Lessons were taught in French or English that many children did not speak. In a workplace, the supervisors were often harsh and the supposed training purpose of the work was either limited or not. There, this is from the Canadian Encyclopedia of an article of residential schools in Canada by J.R. Miller, published October 10, 2012, updated by Tabitha de Bruin, David Gallant, Michelle Fielis, last updated January 11, 2024 as of October 25, 2024. A final report coming from the Truth and Reconciliation Commission, published in 2015, outlines several undeniable conclusions about the system. First, the federal government failed to set clear goals and standards for education at the residential schools. Second, the curriculum at residential schools was essentially an elementary curriculum, which reflected a belief that Indigenous people were intellectually inferior. Third, the government did not develop or implement a policy regarding teacher qualification. Fourth, the teaching staff was, in general, underqualified, overworked, and poorly paid. Fifth, the curriculum, which emphasized the 4Rs, reading, writing, arithmetic, and religion, was not only basic, but also largely irrelevant to the students' needs, experiences, or interests. Sixth, students left school without the skills they needed to either succeed in their home communities or in the broader labor market. Moreover, many of them left without completing their education. In short, the education and vocational training provided by residential schools was inadequate, unquote. The effects after leaving a school. The school system left Indigenous students confused and insecure, with a feeling they don't belong in any Indigenous nor settler society. Here's a quote on someone's experience similar to this topic coming from Canadian Encyclopedia of an article of residential schools in Canada by J.R. Miller, published October 10, 2012, updated by Tabitha de Bruin, David Gallant, Michelle Fielis, last updated January 11, 2024 as of October 25, 2024. Quote, John Tutusis, who attended the Delmas boarding school, also known as the Thunderchild School in Saskatchewan, was blunt in his assessment of the residential school system. When an Indian comes out of these places, it is like being put between two walls in a room and left hanging in the middle. On one side are all the things he learned from his people and their way of life that was being wiped out, and on the other side are the white man's ways, which he could never fully understand, since he never had the right amount of education and could not be part of it. There he is, hanging in the middle of two cultures, and he is not a white man and he is not an Indian. They washed away practically everything from our minds, all the things an Indian needed to help himself, to think the way a human person should in order to survive. John Tutusis, former student at Delmas School, unquote. Abuse at residential schools. Now I'm gonna talk about the abuse and the atrocities that took place at these schools. Impatience and correction often led to excessive punishment, including physical abuse. In some cases, children were heavily beaten, chained, or confined. Some of the staff were sexual predators, and many students were sexually abused. When allegations of sexual abuse were brought forward by students, parents, or staff, the response by government and church officials was, at best, inadequate. The police were rarely contacted, and, even if government or church officials decided that the complaint was worthy, the response was often simply to fire the perpetrator. At other times, they allowed the abuser to keep teaching. I was gonna show the interviews of the residential school survivors, but I decided to just link the interviews and the victims' stories in the description, mainly because I'm wary of copyright. Poor health environment. It wasn't just the abuse that happened. According to the Truth and Reconciliation Commission, an estimated 3,200 Indigenous children died in the overcrowded residential schools. The churches and federal government had poor record keeping. It is unlikely that we will ever know the total lives lost at residential schools. Although the number could be up to 6,000, it's genocide basically. Thousands of Indigenous children never returned home to their families, Students would run away and some would be beaten to death. Literally, students were insufficiently fed and malnutrition ran rampant. The students were vulnerable to diseases such as tuberculosis and influenza, including the Spanish flu epidemic of 1918 to 19. Food was low in quantity and poor in quality, in large part due to concerns about cost. Faced with limited funding, schools were instructed to observe the strictest economy in all particulars. In general, school menus seem to have been both dull and nutritionally inadequate. This is what the food was like according to the Canadian Encyclopedia of an article of residential schools in Canada by J.R. Miller, published October 10, 2012, updated by Tabitha De Bruin, David Gallant, Michelle Fielis, last updated January 11, 2024 as of October 25, 2024. Quote, Menu for the Qui-Appelle, Northwest Territories, Industrial School, 1893. Source, Annual Report of the Department of Indian Affairs, 1893, 174. As quoted in Canada's Residential Schools, the final report of the Truth and Reconciliation Commission of Canada 2015, Volume I, p. 491, for days in the week porridge of oatmeal or cornmeal with either milk or syrup. This is served with hot tea and bread. The working pupils, and those not in robust health, receive butter in addition. On 3 days, all the pupils receive butter and cheese with their bread instead of porridge. This is served with hot tea, dinner, lunch soup, meat or fish, vegetables and bread ad libitum, i.e., not regulated. For dessert, rice or stewed apples, or stewed rhubarb or syrup, or bread and milk, with cold water to drink, excepting to the weak children, and those working outside, who get hot tea. Supper, meat for the working pupils, hash meat and vegetables for the rest, bread ad libitum, and dessert similar to that named for dinner. Hot tea, unquote. Research by a food historian Ian Mosby published in 2013 showed that students at some residential schools in the 1940s and 1950s were forced to undergo nutritional experiments without their permission or their parents. These studies were accepted by different federal government departments and managed by leading nutrition experts. They included restricting some students' access to essential nutrients and dental care in order to assess the effect of improvements made to the diet of other students. Overall, the experiments do not seem to have resulted in any long-term benefits. Nutritional deficiencies and overcrowding led to common outbreaks of diseases at the schools. Tuberculosis and influenza were the major cause of death. Students were also affected by other outbreaks such as smallpox, measles, typhoid, diphtheria, pneumonia, and whooping cough. Louise Moine, who attended the Qui-Appelle School in the Northwest Territories, remembered one year in the early 20th century when tuberculosis was on the rampage. Quote, there was a death every month on the girls' side, and some of the boys went also. We were always taken to see the girls who had died. The sisters invariably had them dressed in light blue, and they always looked so peaceful and angelic. We were led to believe that their souls had gone to heaven, and this would somehow lessen the grief and sadness we felt in the loss of one of our little schoolmates. There would be a requiem mass in the chapel. We would all escort the body, which was lying in a simple handmade coffin, to the graveyard, which was located close to the RC Roman Catholic Church in the village. Louise Moine, former student at Qui-Appelle Residential School, unquote. Although medical experts such as Dr. Peter Bryce, Dr. James Lafferty, Dr. O.I. Grain, and Dr. E.L. Stone recommended measures to improve health and medical treatment, these were not implemented by the government, mainly due to worries about cost and resistance by the churches. Quote, the schools could have helped children to reduce their vulnerability to tuberculosis by providing them with sanitary, well-ventilated living quarters, an adequate diet, warm clothing, and sufficient rest. Rather, the residential schools regularly failed to provide the healthy living conditions, nutritious food, sufficient clothing, and physical regime that would prevent students from getting sick in the first place, and would allow those who were infected a fighting chance at recovery. Canada's residential schools, the final report of the Truth and Reconciliation Commission of Canada 2015, Volume I, p. 451, unquote. Resistance and closure. Indigenous students and parents resisted and protested the harsh regime in place at most residential schools. Some children refused to cooperate and deliberately damaged the operations of the kitchen or classroom, stole food and supplies, or ran away, as did Cheney Wenjack in 1966. At least 25 fires were set by students as a form of protest. Their parents and political leaders protested the school's harsh conditions and teaching shortcomings, though their objections were mostly ignored. By the 1940s, it now became obvious to both the government and most missionary bodies that the schools were ineffective, and Indigenous protests helped to secure a change in policy. In 1969, the system was taken over by the Department of Indian Affairs, ending church involvement. The government decided to phase out the schools, but this met with resistance from the Catholic Church, which felt that isolated education was the best approach for Indigenous children. Some Indigenous communities also resisted closure of the schools, arguing either that denominational schools should remain open or that the schools should be transferred to their own control. By 1986, most schools had either been closed or turned over to local bands. 10 years later, Gordon Residential School in Punachie, Saskatchewan, finally closed its doors. Good riddance to those schools. Ground-penetrating radar searches. It still doesn't stop here. Even after all the schools are closed, most of the deceased children are unknowingly buried at the former residential school sites. In May of 2021, Tecumlupste Secwepemc First Nation in British Columbia hired a team of specialists to conduct ground-penetrating radar searches on the grounds of the former Kamloops Indian Residential School. They detected ground disturbances and later concluded that these were 200 possible burials at the site. In operation by the Catholic Church from 1890 to 1969, the Kamloops Indian Residential School reported up to 500 children registered each year, according to the National Center for Truth and Reconciliation. The 2008 TRC was told that only 50 deaths had occurred at the school. The school closed in 1978 after the federal government took over control in 1969. There have been findings using ground-penetrating technologies at few residential school sites to the sensitive process, grief, and impact on communities. It is presumed that historical records applicable to deaths at the schools are flawed due to some Catholic orders refusing to give out statistics on the schools. As a result, similar findings, such as those at the Kamloops Indian Residential School, could occur in the future. Recovery, reparations, and reconciliation. Indigenous communities, often with church support, and since 1998, with government financial assistance, have been giving out the difficult work of supporting their members with the long-term impact of residential schools, including family breakdowns, violence, and feeling without a purpose. In the late 1990s, former students demanded that the government and churches publicly acknowledge their role in the schools and provide compensation for their suffering. In 2005, the government created a $1.9 billion compensation package for the survivors of abuse at residential schools. In 2007, the government and the churches that had ran the schools agreed to give financial compensation to former students under the Residential Schools Settlement Agreement. On the 11th of June 2008, Prime Minister Stephen Harper offered an apology to all former students of residential schools in Canada. The apology openly recognized that the assimilation policy on which the schools were established was wrong, has caused great harm, and has no place in our country. The apology recognized the extremely damaging and lasting impact the schools had on Indigenous culture, heritage, and language, and was one of the steps that the government has taken to rebuild relationships with Indigenous peoples in Canada. Harper's apology and the compensation packages did not include the residential school survivors in Newfoundland and Labrador, mainly because Canada didn't control the territory at the time when the schools were active. After survivors launched a class action lawsuit against the government, a settlement of $50 million was reached on the 10th of May 2016. The settlement was approved by Newfoundland and Labrador Supreme Court Justice Robert Stack on the 28th of September 2016. On the 24th of November 2017, Prime Minister Justin Trudeau apologized to survivors of residential schools in Newfoundland and Labrador. During 2020, the government announced it is assigning to former residential schools Shubenacadie Residential School in Nova Scotia and Portage La Prairie Residential School in Manitoba as National Historic Sites. The government is also recognizing the residential school system as an event of historic importance in Canada. The government recognized every September 30th as a National Day for Truth and Reconciliation on the 3rd of June 2021 onwards. The day honors the survivors of residential schools as well as including their families. Another commemorative day, Orange Shirt Day, is also held every year on the 30th of September. Orange Shirt Day began in 2013 and was inspired by residential school survivor Phyllis Webstad. On Phyllis Webstad's first day at a residential school, her shirt was forcefully taken away by authorities and never given back. Orange shirts are worn to commemorate all those children who had their culture taken away from them. In September 2021, Queen Elizabeth II celebrated Canada's first National Day for Truth and Reconciliation. She said, quote, "I join with all Canadians on this first National Day for Truth and Reconciliation to reflect on the painful history that Indigenous peoples endured in residential schools in Canada and on the work that remains to heal and to continue to build an inclusive society," unquote. As Canada's head of state, the Queen is being asked to apologize for the Crown's role in the operation of residential schools. Pope Francis apologized for the Catholic Church's involvement in residential schools in March 2022. The Pope asked forgiveness for the deplorable conduct of those members of the Catholic Church who were involved in the residential school system. Representatives of Indigenous peoples who traveled to Rome to talk with the Pope heard the historic apology in person. The leader of the Métis National Council, Cassidy Caron, said that, quote, "An apology is one step forward, but there is more work to be done," unquote. During July 2022, Pope Francis traveled to Canada and offered an apology on Canadian land. He said, quote, "I humbly beg forgiveness for the evil committed by so many Christians against the Indigenous peoples," unquote. The Pope acknowledged that his apology is only a step toward making improvements and that an investigation must be managed into the events of the past. Many have requested the Church for financial compensation as well as other forms of reconciliation, including the return of Indigenous artifacts, the release of school records, and the overturning of the doctrine of discovery. On the 30th of September 2019, the names of 2,800 children who died in residential schools in Canada were released by the National Centre for Truth and Reconciliation in a ceremony in Gatineau, Quebec. The ceremony was the highest of years of archival research of government and church records dealing with Indigenous children in 80 schools across the country, with records going back as far as the 1890s. According to archivists, another 1,600 children who died in residential schools remain unnamed, and researchers continue to pore over records to discover their identities. The names and schools of the children were displayed on a huge 47-meter-long, blood-red cloth banner. A residential school survivor and member of the Indian Residential School Survivor Committee and advisory body to the Truth and Reconciliation Commission, TIA-O-QUI-AHT First Nation elder Dr. Barney Williams, believes that the ceremony was important to ensure that the children who died are not forgotten. He said, quote, "Today is a special day not only for myself, but for thousands of others, like me, across the country to finally bring recognition and honor to our school chums, to our cousins, our nephews, to our nieces that were forgotten," unquote. It was a very emotional and heartwarming moment to thousands of Indigenous families and Williams himself of revealing 2,800 names of residential school victims. 5. Truth and Reconciliation. There is this thing you may have heard quite a few times within this documentary. If you want to learn more about the Truth and Reconciliation Commission of Canada, I have it linked within my sources as well in the description. Here's the basic explanation on what it is. I will read part of it from the official site. Quote, "The Truth and Reconciliation Commission of Canada (TRC) was created through a legal settlement between residential school survivors, the Assembly of First Nations, Inuit representatives, and the parties responsible for creation and operation of the schools, the federal government and the church bodies. The TRC's mandate was to inform all Canadians about what happened in residential schools. The TRC documented the truth of survivors, their families, communities, and anyone personally affected by the residential school experience. This included First Nations, Inuit and Métis former residential school students, their families, communities, the churches, former school employees, government officials, and other Canadians. The TRC concluded its mandate in 2015 and transferred its records to the safekeeping of National Center for Truth and Reconciliation in CTR," unquote. Beyond 94. There is also a really helpful site that shows the Truth and Reconciliation progress completion by the 94 calls to action. Again, this is also linked in the description in my sources. Before I go, I'm not very good with conclusions, but I've been very passionate about this project. I am very thankful for all the things that made this project possible. I've been wary of copyright, which was a problem, which made me hesitant to make this project in the first place, which is why I was unable to show clips of other videos on this. Overall, the research was a bit hard for me to go over, mainly due to the main topic obviously. In any case, I'll see you all in the next video. Every child matters. Miigwech.